1. A few years back, I was working as a full-time ski coach. What that meant for the week was I had to basically single-handedly put on a 3-day event where people could buy and sell used ski and snowboard equipment, with the team getting a percentage cut of all sales. A ski swap, if you will. Setting up this event took a week, and while I had a lot of help, basically everything funneled through me. It was exhausting, but a lot of kids paid their team fees from fundraising events like this. The night before the event, I got home at about midnight. I had worked all day, about 16 hours, and when I got to my bed, I could not wait to fall asleep for about 4 hours before opening day, when I had to be at the top of my game to sell as much equipment as possible to benefit the team. My upstairs neighbors, who I really did not know, were incessantly pounding into the floor. I knew they had a few young kids and had this happened one time before, so I tapped on the ceiling with a broomstick. They were not fazed by this, which was a little confusing as it worked before. Nothing major, just a "hey, trying to sleep here." You couldn't really hear when walking or anything regular, and a little noise is to be expected, but this was not that. I am a young guy and typically stay up pretty late, so it's never really been an issue if they're kind of loud, but this sounded like a 200-pound man jumping off the counter type of banging. I try to sleep, even put in earplugs, but this was shaking the building. After I had enough, and it was about 1:30 a.m., on a Wednesday, by the way, I grabbed a big long wooden ski and pounded on the ceiling 3 or 4 times. Without skipping a beat, they pounded back, and then continued whatever activity they were doing that quite literally had art on my wall, noticeably vibrating. I did it again, and they returned with a bang, bang, bang onto their floor, my ceiling. My roommate at the time worked nights, so I was home alone. I had a decent stereo system in the closet, so I hooked it all up and turned on an 8-hour Excision playlist at full volume with the speakers pointing towards the ceiling. One of them on top of my kitchen cabinets. If you don't know what Excision is, think grinding metal dubstep sounds. It's kind of disorienting for someone who doesn't regularly listen to that kind of stuff. At that point, I knew I only had a couple of hours to sleep, if at all, anyway, so I left, went to a friend's house and crashed for a few minutes, and then went to work. The speakers blared at full volume until 7 a.m. when my roommate got home. I didn't really want to be that petty, but it was so rude that late at night to pound back into the floor that I had enough. Never again did we have any issues with the noise. 2. This took place years ago, but still makes me laugh at the sheer stupidity of it all. It starts, as all truly great sagas published on the internet began, when I met a random guy through a friend at a bar in the city. Mark. My friend had introduced me to Mark, because for a few years leading up to that introduction, I shared an idea I had for a business with anyone who would listen. I was told Mark wanted to start his own business, had worked in the industry, knew a lot about the subject matter required, and thought my idea was good. Mark and I had met up for lunch. We hit it off. He said he'd start the business as the CEO and agreed to me taking a part-time operational role. I agreed to help solely in a part-time operational role because I couldn't afford to quit my day job. I put in 15% of the cash for 5% ownership, since Mark was going to put in founder hours, 80+ hours a week, and agreed to put up 85% of the cash, which was more money than I could afford to risk on a new venture. I worked part-time. I did what I said I would do. I even tried to be of assistance on things I had no experience with. I contacted Mark with a fella I had done business with before, Paul. Paul and I got into a dispute ourselves. Anyway, let's fast forward a few months, and I got into a dispute with Mark over stationery. Yes, stationery, not being to his liking, caused him to flip out. This was despite him picking the stationery out. Next up, the contract I got from Mark was not what we agreed. The legal work required a few months to get done, and I had expected delays, but when I finally got it, the paperwork didn't represent what I had agreed to own. Not only that, but my investment wasn't being acknowledged under the terms we had committed to when I put the money in. Now, as I said, I wasn't able to risk much, and I only invested with what I could afford to lose. So this wasn't a huge sum of money. I didn't want to make a big deal about it since the amount was small, and he began promising a new contract when the business could pay for the lawyers to make changes. I signed nothing, and it worsened. Mark and I start to fight any time we're in a room together. As I think back, it's almost comical how angry he would get in my presence. I have other things to do with my time than squabble over stuff like stationery, so I worked in my areas of the business and hoped things would grow. I stopped in whenever I could and help out regularly as needed with as little Mark interaction as possible. Paul would intervene sometimes when Mark would get particularly difficult to be around. Anyway, fast forward about 2 years, and Mark couldn't help but tell anyone who will listen that the business is going well. I have no idea how well things are going, because Mark isn't giving me any updates. I get a call around Christmas from Mark. He wishes me a happy holiday, then drops the bomb on me that he wants to terminate my involvement and refund my investment. I decline the investment refund and say I'm happy to no longer work for him. In my head, I think it's kind of hilarious that he thinks this will just end that easily, but I say nothing on that accord to him. Mark and I hang up with him aggravated about my refusal to take the refund on my investment. He then sends me an email that I had resigned. This had no basis in fact, but certainly was creative about what we had just discussed. I correct him immediately in a reply stating that he no longer wanted to work together and that I can see that as being the case, but want to discuss my investment. A few days later, Mark demands I come pick up a check for a reimbursement of my investment. I do not come and get it. Next thing you know, the company attorney huffs and puffs and tries to scare me with some strongly worded letter. This is the same idiot attorney who screwed up my contract to work on a business and my investment agreement. We'll call him Mr. Khan. I sent an email in response to Mr. Khan that he screwed up. The company seems to be doing well, that I hear rumors about how well, and that I want to be on this for the foreseeable future, and I will not take a one-for-one cash out for what I put in. The attorney then emails me back stating in writing that Mark never accepted my electronic transfer into the company account. Instead, Mark has another company he accepted the money into, a company I've never heard of. A company that is different than the name of the recipient on my electronic transfer. A company that would be committing wire fraud to accept the money I sent. On that note, I did some sleuthing online. I found out Mark had been forming one company every month or two. Then there were media reports and documents he let slip in shared drives he forgot I had access to from when we agreed to work together. Mark was too cheap and stupid to pay for tech help, so he was using my shared folders I had created, and I certainly wasn't obligated to turn off shares if he wanted to work out of them. Those documents showed me Mark had recently raised money in the company I had sent the payment to at 200 times the valuation I had bought into it at, and Mark didn't disclose my investment to the new investors. He had, however, put me on the documents showing my ownership to previous investors, not on documents I had ever seen before, but documents he had been sending around. When I share my suspicions that he is committing wire fraud to Mr. Khan, I am told that I am the one breaking the law by knowing anything about the investment documents the company has used. Mr. Khan tells me that by not picking up my check, I will not be entitled to any money, and to contact law enforcement if I think something illegal has happened. He cautions, though, that I'll be the one in trouble. Cue the malicious compliance. I let the different respective members of the Securities and Exchange Commission, along with law enforcement, know what happened to me. I provided them all the documents I had from the matter. It took about 5 years for the investigation to conclude, for charges to be brought, for a trial to conclude, and for Mark to go to jail. They say the government is slow, but they aren't kidding with just how slow. Maybe it was slow because Mark was running a large, tens of millions of dollars large fraud. Anyway, Mark will be serving time for about 30 felony charges they brought on covering the details of his Ponzi scheme. He will be away for a long time. I never did anything wrong. With the information I was able to provide, Mr. Khan ended up getting disbarred. There were other things Mr. Khan did outside of what is shared here that I cannot share, or it could help to identify me to the folks involved. The investigators credited me with bringing the fraud to their attention. I lost my money in this ordeal, but gained an education, and I got to help bring down a crook. The sheer stupidity of Mark is that he didn't even follow the business plan I had. He just used it as a story to convince investors to give him money. It is a business model that works very, very well. It took a few more years, but I am now in a position to be pursuing this business full-time, with people of high integrity, who all work together to ensure each other's success. We expect to have an extremely profitable year in 2023, after proving the business model worked in 2022. 3. A few years back, I found a place for rent where the couple who owned the property also lived at the main house, adjacent to the rental. I think there were 3 units in the building I lived, which was a stone throw to the main house. At first, I found the husband and wife to be very friendly. They showed me the place, explained that everybody that lived there had been living there for a long time and loved it. They came a little bit over the top on their sales pitch. Not that I didn't believe that the place was probably pretty decent given the neighborhood. So I stopped by and dropped a deposit check, thinking that they will have a lease ready. But the wife explained to me that although she doesn't have the lease ready, it will be ready in a couple of days and I can leave the check. I wasn't too worried about it, so I did mention that I will probably need to see the lease before moving forward, but I would be happy to leave her with the check today. We didn't get into the details, but they cashed the check. I came back a few days later to sign the lease, but I found some of the terms to be a little bit off, however legal. One of the clauses stated anybody coming over the house would essentially constitute a party, and that I would need permission for any parties. I explained to them, being in my 30s, that I didn't plan to have any parties per se, but because I had a lot of friends and family in the area, barbecues and small gatherings were just part of my lifestyle. I called them out on the permission, and I said I would be willing to move forward and am a respectful tenant, and would obviously keep the volume down no matter what I'm doing, but I didn't like the idea of asking their permission to have over a couple of friends from time to time. They had already cashed the check, and not wanting to get into a legal conflict, I told them I think we really should go our separate ways. They then explained that I was committed to the property, and I would lose my deposit. I retorted that we did not have a complete agreement because they were asking me to now sign something with terms I was not comfortable with, and unless they wanted me to move in without signing anything, my deposit would be refundable. They tried to stonewall me, which I actually thought was pretty funny. So I decided to call them up, get them both on speaker, and I sarcastically said something like, "You know, I'm really excited to move into this little guest apartment next door to you. I just can't wait for us to be neighbors. I mean, especially because you guys are going to be just like my parents. Anytime I'm having friends over, I'll knock on the door and we can talk about it. And we can make sure you're okay with me having friends over. This is going to be a great time. I think you should try to strong-arm me and keep my deposit. I think this whole relationship was meant to be." You could have heard a pin drop a mile away. Just the tone that I used and my sarcasm netted me an immediate return of my deposit. I'd like to think I sounded somewhat like a serial killer. I had the biggest shit-eating grin on my face when I came to pick up that check. The husband was waiting for me on the front porch, and the wife was inside the house looking out the window. Sometimes I hate people. I often wonder how many times someone in their shoes gets away with bullshit because the person in my shoes doesn't know how to play the game. I share the story because we're the only ones watching out for ourselves. Don't be afraid to challenge something that doesn't feel right. Cheers. 4. I work in student halls of residence for a smallish campus-based university in the UK. This involves malicious compliance after a group of students had been bullying one of their flatmates, Sarah, and happened within the last 10 years. Sarah was neurodivergent and had plenty of interests. None of these interests involved going out partying. She preferred to live in a quiet, cleaner environment. The other four had similar interests to each other, very typical first-year in hall stuff. There were kitchen parties after clubbing at 3 a.m., alleged drug use, post-party leaving strangers passed out on the kitchen floor, empty bottles everywhere, and piles of rubbish washing up and generally messy. Normally, a student would report this. We give out contact details that can be used for anonymous reporting. Or we'd offer flat meetings to help them compromise. Example, agreeing to limit parties to a certain number of times a week, checking with each other before planning one in case someone has a big deadline and needs quiet on a specific night, cleaning rotas, etc. And the cleaners could issue fines if it was a mess on a weekly cleaning day. But Sarah was terrified of reporting anything and found interacting with staff very difficult. We only knew there was an issue because she would tell her mum, and her mum would tell us. We had offered a swap, but she told Mum that she didn't want to move as it would disrupt her routine and it wasn't fair for her to be punished when she followed the rules. So we were working with her and her mum to try and get her to the point where she could formally report it, referring her to well-being services and doing random flat checks at night to see if we could catch the students using drugs, and had the cleaners on the lookout for evidence as well. This carried on until term 2, and by then the four had clearly decided they just didn't like her and thought she was weird. The inconsiderate behavior had escalated to bullying. She'd recorded them, calling her some horrible names, and played it back to us. But again refused to send us the recording and wouldn't formally report it. I appreciate she wasn't helping herself, but I don't think she was being deliberately difficult. She just really struggled with certain things. Her flatmates had definitely figured out what pushed her buttons. We were trying to mediate, flat meetings, trying to enable her to feel safe in reporting their behavior formally, etc. But it was obvious to staff they wanted to push her to move out, and they had a friend who was always hanging out in their kitchen who clearly wanted to move in. One day, she must have snapped and she threw a glass across the room, causing it to smash on the wall. It didn't hit anyone, but they jumped on this and all their parents were on the phone about how their daughters were living with someone dangerous. At this point, we have no evidence of their bullying or breaches of their tenancy, but they have evidence against her, and it all on mass filed reports. We have no choice but to move her. Here comes the malicious compliance. Not even before we'd sent cleaners into her old room, we started getting requests for the friend to move in. Apparently a supportive person who would help with the trauma, and someone else in the room would give them closure. The idea of them getting their way in this manner infuriated me. Instead, we asked one of our older and more experienced resident advisors, a final-year student, if they could move in. This is someone they would not be able to bully, and had a good idea about what had really been going on in that flat. It was a nice flat in a very new building, so it was a bit of a perk for them as well. The best bit was the parents ringing to complain about how we'd moved a stranger in and how upset their daughters were. When I explained we put a very experienced resident advisor in there, who had training in peer support, all their arguments collapsed. The requirements, supportive person, and room relet for closure. Tick and tick. Sorry, no more kitchen drug parties for your daughters this year. P.S. Sarah didn't have any further action taken against her for the glass throwing. She did actually get some additional well-being involvement, and it was deemed that the move was penalty enough, an incident unlikely to reoccur. She loved her new flat. It was a single-occupancy studio in a really nice building, and we kept her on lower rent. Her mum said the studio was perfect as she could control the mess and no one moved her stuff. She felt safe. She actually rebooked a studio for the following year and did go on to finish her degree. I have no idea what happened to the other students. I hope they look back and reflect on what they did, but sadly, part of me doubts it. At any rate, given we'd ruined their party venue, I hope they'd managed to get some studying done. 5. A few years ago, I was an IT analyst for an aerospace company in Toronto. There were 3 sites, and 1 analyst for each site. I was barely able to keep up with the workload for my site, but managed. One day I found out that one analyst had given a month notice and had already quit. The company did not replace him. I had to drive daily between cities to manage both sites. Shortly after, my boss was let go, and I was given a new boss who lived in another country. The work piled up, and several employees at a time would have non-working computers because there was nobody to help them. I had to stop supporting projects that I was involved in with other managers, like getting 20 computers for the factory floor. This was definitely going to blow up, and I needed to cover myself. I had a talk with the GM and explained that I'd get walk-ups, phone calls, texts, and emails, because most of the employees refused to use the ticket system. I'd even have employees coming up to me when I was on a call and try talking in my ear. The GM decided that all requests must come in the form of a ticket. I adopted a no ticket equals no work policy and enforced it on all employees and managers. I also stopped answering texts and calls. I'd answer all email requests with "please open a ticket." Most managers refused, so I would just thank them for the time while they fumed off to file a complaint against me. A week went by with no copier on the main floor because everyone refused to open a ticket to request more ink. Everyone had to walk downstairs to make their copies. A week went by with several lathes in the factory not working because everyone refused to open a ticket. Several computer illiterate and lazy employees would now have to ask their co-workers for help because they refused to open a ticket. And now they're behind in their work. Sometimes a new employee would spend 2 or 3 days in the office with no laptop and no user account because their request never came in the form of a ticket. Employees would go on business trips without laptops because they refused to open a ticket. This went on for several months, and I was able to partially manage both sites, but it was exhausting arguing with everyone every day. I'd get threatened by management all the time, but nothing would ever come of it. I found out one day that the company wasn't planning on replacing the employee who quit, so I had enough. I spent a few weeks declining requests as usual, but when they came from a manager, I'd add, "and if you don't like it, then fire me, request denied." Eventually, I decided my mental health was more valuable than the company, and when the last analyst went on vacation, I simply left my phone and laptop on my desk and stopped coming in for my shifts. 0 notice given. A week later, I got a call from HR. They found my wife's number as an emergency contact and said I let them down and there was nobody to help. I replied with "good, now you know how it feels," and left it at that. 6 months later, the only analyst left tells me the company replaced my position with 2, but they're still in rough shape. All they had to do was replace an employee. Hey everybody, Hellraiser here, and thank you very much for listening to Revenge is Ice Cream, episode 224. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. Please do pop a like before you go, and share the video with friends and family. That encourages YouTube to let other people know this video is worth watching. Okay, let's see. I don't think we have any birthday shoutouts today, so it's today's date anyway. It is something of the something and something. I'll be honest with you, I don't know what date it is. I'm recording these videos in a jumble. But let's move right along to Hellfreezer's question of the day. And this one popped up while I was chatting to my partner last night, and the thought occurred to me. Stephen King's one of those authors who's just so popular. He's been so prolific. Almost forgot that word for a second there. That you could probably find a Stephen King book in most houses. So, the question I have to ask is my theory true? Because even I own one Stephen King book. It's a copy of Pet Sematary. I started reading it years ago. I've not actually finished it. But do you? And if you do, what one? Or is it more than one? Please do leave your answers in a comment below. And with that, I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourself.